Estábamos sentadas viendo tele, viendo caricaturas, porque siempre veíamos eso a esa hora después de la escuela. El ruido es de lo que más me acuerdo. Como que algo se está cayendo, como que viene debajo de la tierra. Y me acuerdo que trataba de pararme, de levantarme del piso y me temblaban las piernas. De eso me acuerdo. Se siente larguísimo, largo, que no termina. Son segundos los que dura, pero se siente larguísimo. Y al nomás salir estaban las champitas enfrente. Y me acuerdo que se caían y como eran de lodo, ¿no? Se levantaba polvo. No sé quién llegó primero, si mi papá o la Patti, pero me acuerdo que la Patti dijo que alguien, no sé si me acuerdo bien de esto, pero me acuerdo que alguien de la escuela se la llevó, era como un pick-up, me acuerdo que dijo, que contó algo así. Siguieron los temblores fuertes que casi uno piensa que va a volver a ser otro terremoto. Toda la gente durmió afuera, en medio del pasaje. Allí entre todos los vecinos, como la gente bien, allá es bien amigable y todo, ¿no? Entonces, los bichos estaban allí, no se sentía como tanto, como tristeza, como que de lo que estaba pasando, porque estábamos entre todos y ahí crecimos y todo, entonces nos conocíamos bien y...
Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in to join us. My name is Adam. I'm the program manager at Latitude 53. We are, of course, located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and Métis people. And it is our privilege to exist here and to be part of the communities that continue to exist here and have always existed here, as well as everyone else who has come to this place. Today, I am pleased that I get to introduce Michelle Campos Castillo, who has an exhibition up in our garage space right now. And this year, for our garage series, we have invited artists to work with a writer or interpreter of their work. And so today, Michelle is joined by Zachary Ayotte, who helped to propose her exhibition. As well, the two of them have invited Christina Battle to join them in conversation and talk a bit about the work and the background that it comes out of. So without further ado, I would love to bring those three on. And I'll just throw it over to you three, if that's all right. Welcome.
Hi, thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Hi. How are you guys doing? This is my first public Zoom chat, and I was surprised. I got a little nervous at the beginning. I was like, "Oh, I'm at home. This is funny." Anyway, I'm so glad that we get to have this conversation. Michelle, I wanted to start, I guess, thinking about your process and your approach, especially in relation to sort of the bigger project you have of creating a larger graphic novel. And I'm curious about the distinction between working on the page and working on the wall, and how that process differed, or how it maybe made you think about what you were doing a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think literally, it just made me think bigger, and utilize the space around me that I'm definitely not used to, even in my day-to-day as a designer. I'm very much working in 2 dimensions, so just being in the space was a new experience. And I think it fits the sort of graphic novel and comics format really well because, you know, it's a space that you can play with, like format, and you can just like express things that are like harder to describe, at least for me, right? You can just, you know, sort of expand those thoughts on the wall, especially in this instance where I'm thinking about like, you know, memory or dreams or, you know, child imagination. It just, yeah, it fit really well in that sense.
And do you think, this is one of the things I was thinking about earlier today, is that the parameters of the page and the parameters of the wall are so much different. But one of the things that's I find so interesting about your work on the wall is that it's not segmented into panels the way that graphic novels so often are. Like, do you think about it as one piece, or do you, like, maybe that's a silly question, but
I guess, yeah, I feel like it's definitely like one continuous piece that I wanted to work on, and I kind of wanted it to be in the sense that you can kind of jump in wherever, and it kind of still tells you something, you know. You don't have to start anywhere specific. And just also, I mean, even just like the way there's like the way the gallery is like set up, like you can kind of enter through like two different ways too. So like, you know, so I wanted not necessarily have to be like you have to step through this specific way to, you know, get a sense of what's going on.
Right. That's awesome. And did the idea, like, one of the things I was so struck by was using that just continuous sort of black background that ran all the way across the wall. It almost feels like fabric in a bit. Like in some ways, it made me think about textiles. Is that similar to how you work on a page, or was it like, how did that idea sort of come about?
I mean, the black was definitely, you know, thinking about, you know, nighttime when all this went down. But yeah, the way it kind of flows, you know, like the way when I started sketching it out, it was definitely just like, you know, kind of some quick black strokes, you know, to just like get the idea out. So yeah, it made sense to translate that, but it does like very much reflect textiles. I think like a lot of time in my practice, I think about textiles. Textiles are like a huge part of like our culture. Like you can see some on my bed right there. And, you know, when I think about this show and things I would do different, and like the hammocks are very much part of that, that sense of textiles as well. Like, you know, our textiles are very much made by like indigenous people in Guatemala and stuff. So, so I think it kind of reflects like that flow of fabric. Like the hammocks were such a huge part in my memory. So like, I think it fits well with that, that flow of fabric.
Yeah, it's interesting how much I was thinking about all of the images that I could remember this morning, and how hopeful it was. You know, like it's images of like rest and nourishment and gathering. For the most part, I feel like it's even taking it out of something that's a disaster. I felt like the narrative that you convey is one of coming together and one of and hope.
Yeah, and I mean that's also like my romanticized take of that time, and it's something that like in working on a bigger project, like I think part of why I've avoided it is because it means like, you know, digging into these things and remembering the ways that it was like a really hard time, and the ways that I have to dispel those childhood like myths that I've created around that. But, you know, from what I what I remember of that space is just like, it's informed my sense of community, because it was this group of people in this neighborhood that went through so much, but like I didn't feel scared. So like, I feel like the adults really did their job,
Yeah.
and making us kids just feel like okay with what was going on. And looking back at it, like, you mentioned in your description, it wasn't just like the fact that we're prone to natural disasters, but, this all happened in the middle of like a civil war. So it's just like, there's a lot going on.
I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the process of just even making a work that is so personal, and especially one that engages with these histories and these memories that you're sort of making sense with, you've been sitting with for so long. And when it comes to, like you were mentioning, the sketching of the hammocks even, like, is that a sketch that you had been working through for a long time, or was it something that you settled on doing specifically for this opportunity in this space?
I'm just starting to, I feel like the hammocks do play a significant role, just in even thinking on like my memories of El Salvador, and like even the last few times I've visited, where it just has kind of been a place to escape to, and now in thinking on it more, I'm just like, it's like a little womb, you're just kind of like, it just like really cradles you. So I think there's an aspect of that I've been thinking about and been wanting to recreate for a while. And it is like really personal, and in a way too, I had to like work through, like it's work that's been in the making for a very long time, because I've had to work through a lot, go to therapy, and eventually you sort of get permission from my family a bit, and be like, can I talk about these things? And also like, not just permission for them, but just even, I feel like I also needed like outside validation from seeing other artwork, or just like encouraging friends and artists and curators for me to be like, okay, these stories are worth talking about. So it's been a long time, and that these images have been in my head. So it definitely feels like a good release to finally get them out there for the first time. But I just feel like they've just been circling around in here for a long time.
Did you want to talk about some of those inspirations? You were saying that getting sort of the validation to feel like your story was worth telling. Mm-hmm. Did you want to talk about some of the things that kind of opened you up to that possibility?
Yeah, I think it was like probably over 10 years ago, where a friend of mine showed me the Memoir Persepolis, which is a graphic novel memoir. And if you're not familiar with it, people aren't familiar with it, it tells the story of this Iranian woman who immigrates to France in the 80s during like, the conflict in Iran. And like, I guess that was the first time I felt like we had permission to talk about these things. But it was also like, and it was also the process of immigrating and assimilation that made me think like I didn't want to be different, and I feel like this thing made me so different. So like, I didn't want to talk about it, so that was validation in the sense that like her telling her story, it made sense to me on like an artistic level, where like, just because I have this background in illustration, that I could, do something like that. But yeah, validation in terms of telling like that kind of story, and it being okay to share that. But yeah, just like, many years of encouragement, and from like friends to actually put things together. But I mean, I think that's the power of like giving diverse voices space to tell these stories, because it really does open possibilities for everyone else who hasn't felt like, they have that space.
Yeah, that gets me thinking too about like the different types of space where you are given the opportunity to tell a story. So Zach, when you were talking about physically in the gallery space of how different this work operates for viewers compared to like reading a book or a graphic novel, and knowing that you're working in graphic novel as a format in addition to this or along with this, is there something about like the idea of working in not only the space of this particular gallery, but like the contemporary art sense or conversation that's a little bit different for how you would approach working with this story in a physical book form?
Yeah, it's really different. And honestly, like it goes back to the idea of validation. Like Michelle Schultz, who's the executive at Latitude, she's heard me talk about my like long form memoir project, you know, and because Walter Scott was doing something in the gallery, who's like a Canadian comics artist, you know, it made sense to sort of pair us. But, you know, there hasn't been a lot of, or like I haven't experienced a lot of like comic arts in gallery spaces. So again, it's that idea of validation where it's just like, oh, I can do this in a gallery space, you know, and like I hadn't even thought of that prior. You know, I thought I would be hopefully doing a book, but for now it's just creating these things, which a lot of the times are, you know, created on my computer, right? And anytime I've put out like anything comics based before has been just to exist in Instagram or you know, online somewhere. So yeah, it was like a really different sense and a push for me to like take up the space, right? Because it's a really big space to take up. So it's just like, yeah, there was definitely many steps of like confidence building and like, again, pushing myself to think bigger, you know, outside of just the page.
Yeah, that's it's so interesting. I'm sitting in front of the window and somebody just caught a fishing line on a power line. It looks like like I'm just like, how did this happen? Anyway,
Alberta.
I know. I was just like, this is where else? Anyway, one of the things that was so interesting is thinking about, as you're saying that, like I think that not just comic arts, but the sort of narrative storytelling is one of those things that maybe you don't see as often in a gallery space, and I feel like I'm starting to see more of that, or a rise in that, or a different way of approaching it. And there's something interesting I find that happens when you start to incorporate narrative in this form of storytelling into a gallery space, in the sense that I wonder if it's more, if it levels the playing field in a way. If somehow when everybody comes in, there's a similar approach to how you can come to the work because you're kind of guided through it in a different way. Did you want to talk about the sort of approach to storytelling a little bit? Or how you feel about it, I guess.
I mean, it's relatively new for me too. Like I've done these sort of one-off funny comic conversations, maybe just like a few pages. So it's really new to me, and it's been daunting. And I think that's one of the reasons why I haven't began something, you know, and I think our idea of like what contemporary art, you know, is, or what I've experienced is that, you know, it doesn't offer a lot of explanation. So in that sense, like you know, I almost, there's definitely that part of me that questions whether like the storytelling belongs in you know, a gallery space, you know, if it can, or if it's like too literal for the space, just because like we don't see a lot of that. Obviously, like all artworks have a story and background, but like, yeah, this tends to offer a bit more explanation, you know? So like it does, on a personal level, like, you know, make me think about like what does belong in a gallery, or like what constraints I've put on myself as to what belongs in a gallery. Yeah,
it's interesting. I was thinking about, we had talked about the work of Toyin Oji Odutola, And I was listening back to an interview with her and thinking a lot about text and about, because her work is a lot of drawing and illustration, but she doesn't include any text in her work. Is primarily sort of works with fictional narratives. And so I was thinking, what does it mean to exclude, like she has some of it in her titles, but what does it mean to exclude the things that kind of would sort of smooth some of those edges or would maybe create structure? And what do you hold back and what do you then invite sort of the reader to interpret? It made me wonder about your work and if you'd ever, like, again, I think I told you this, but I hesitate to ask this question. But what I made me think about what the work would look like if it was just images or if it was just text, you know. Do you want to talk about how you make the work, whether it's writing first and then illustrating, or how those things thread together?
Yeah, they very much happen at the same time for me. Like, even if it's not a full sketch, I kind of plan out scenes in my head a lot of the times. You know, so maybe the images do come first because I do have these scenes, and like, you know, I've never considered myself a writer, and like I think part of why, you know, the visual format of comic arts like makes a lot of sense to me is that I can draw a lot more of what I want to say than actually, you know, begin to know how to write it. But, you know, it's funny because like some people that came to visit me in the space were like, I don't think you need to have any writing at all, you know, and which would actually make me feel more comfortable because, you know, like I'm not like comfortable with writing. Like, it takes me a very long time to write anything. But at the same time, I feel like we went in the opposite direction where we just kept adding. I don't know why I'm saying we, it's just me. I just kept adding writing. Just because I have a lot of friends that I like, you know, talk to about when I'm doing these things. But so there is kind of a we, takes a village. But yeah, like when I thought about it, I think it was probably my sister Astrid who helped me out a lot. And she was like, you know, we were thinking about who would come to this. And it's like, I can't have any sort of event or exhibition without like my family coming, which is really wonderful, right? But then I started to think about like that accessibility for someone like my mom who speaks English, but like, you know, she will always seek out Spanish first and foremost, right? Everything she consumes is Spanish, right? So it was just like, you know, it became about adding more words in that sense, you know, of like Spanish for her and a translation for whoever needed it. And it was my first language too, right? So, so yeah, I think I like the idea of having no words because like, I do think that ultimately like make things more accessible and like not so literal, and it can kind of make my job easier without having to write. But I do like the fact that I can share this with, my mom essentially, and her friends and stuff, and that she's able to, to access these spaces because of that, you know, and language does that, right? So,
I always think of the language as, I always come to the word generous. Like, it feels very generous to me in terms of it's both vulnerable, I think, for you, and it extends a hand, I think, to the audience in a way, which I've always really appreciated.
Yeah, it's really nice. There's a number of different entry points into the work, which I really appreciate. And now you also have me thinking a lot about the use of the word we, which in the text, I think almost all of it, I have a couple of images I can see in the background as I'm talking, but refer to we as if this is a collective retelling as opposed to an individual one. So maybe if you could speak a bit about that voice, like you've mentioned your family, and we know from the videos that Latitude has also posted that your family was really involved in helping you recall and recount the story. But maybe that difference between the we and the I. that takes place in the work?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, this is also their story, you know, and it's funny because I didn't include them in this writing process. Like my plan was to eventually interview them all. Like we always talk about, you know, things that happen, and there's a sense of this shared experience. But starting to document that, it's probably a bit about like getting older and parents getting older, where you like get the urge to like start documenting people. But when thinking of this project, I really didn't want to speak to them before getting my memory out, because I just felt like it would influence too much of what I remembered. And even my sister, whose video we saw at the beginning, Mila, she when I initially talked to her about the project, she was like, we were together, you know, and I did not remember that, but now I have a sense that we were together, but I'm not sure, right? But it's definitely a we process, and like, you know, when you're talking about not only your, you know, your family, but your culture, it's hard because like you don't want to be speaking for this group of people, and you also don't want to like sort of benefit from people's trauma, you know. So it's just like this fine line that I like wondered about a lot too, where I'm just like, am I just like what am I doing? You know, what is my right to tell their version of things? But I feel like they are much more willing to share their stories. Like they're really happy to have these stories out there, you know, and like they are very willing to share more even beyond this. So it definitely feels like a we in that sense, you know, that it's just not, yeah, I guess maybe not to give myself too much credit, but just like kind of being like the family storyteller, you know, in that sense, you know, because even after we did the interviews, which all happened in one day, because we're all here in Edmonton and within blocks of each other. So I was able to just like drive with the recorder and like do all the interviews in one day. You know, I feel like they all said this with the exception of my mom, and that they all said, okay, well, next we have to talk about the war, you know, that we experienced, you know. And I was like, yeah, that's a much bigger conversation that we're not going to do right now, but you know, but like, I think, which is interesting because for so long, I just really avoided talking about these things. And then, yeah, I feel like there's a sense that they really want to share, you know?
Yeah, maybe I sort of have a question for both of you.
Sure.
Coming off of that, of this greater context that's shaped, to sort of give us all of this background, you know, not everything, but of the circumstances that the earthquake happened situated around and within. So Zach, in your essay text that's you can pick up while you're in the exhibition or read online, you give a lot of background to the history itself. And then I think you end the essay with a phrase, something that's like, this is where the story begins, or this is where our story begins. Mm-hmm. And then there's all of the sort of additional programming elements that are on Latitude's website of the interviews and the New York Times cover, sort of providing that context. So my question is related to that, but maybe I also want to just comment for everyone to just sort of sit with for a second. When you look up the Wikipedia pages for both this earthquake and also for the Civil War in San Salvador, neither mention the other.
Yeah, isn't that remarkable?
It is, and it really gets me thinking about like this role of storytelling as being that thing that can help bring these threads and histories together.
Yeah,
it's kind of like a long throw out of a question, but.
Michelle, do you want to go first? We both just retreat.
Wait, just like, sorry, just talk about having that context, or?
I know, I realized there actually wasn't a question in a minute.
Okay.
But yeah, the question is just, you know, it kind of comes off of this conversation about incorporating text along with image, but also all of this greater context of telling this story. And then maybe also relating to how your family, as you just retold, when wanting to talk about the earthquake, also really wanted to talk about the war. It sort of was a necessary segue. So yeah, like what does it mean to have all those different elements and context available for viewers?
Yeah, I really love the text that Zach wrote. Like I just want to use it for everything now because it's just like, you know, and because for a long time it feels silly now because like the internet has existed for most of my life, but to like maybe it was just too painful to like do research, but you know, so much of these things have felt so random. Like being in Canada, coming to Edmonton have just felt so random. But like, you know, but all these things happening in El Salvador, like, you know, are happening for a reason. Like, you know, the like Zach's text mentions, you know, we're just like right along this fault line, and there's like so many active volcanoes in the country because like the land has shifted so much, you know. So it just like the context is really great for me on a personal level, just like, you know, not just like being flung from space in the sense, it's just like it's a bit grounding in that sense, to just know that there's like context to all these things. I don't know if Zach wants to talk more about that.
I guess well, it's got me thinking about that sort of idea of storytelling compared to data that I think I mentioned, that which is maybe one thing we can talk about. But I think just the power of storytelling itself is so fascinating, and I think how that gets embedded in so many things that we do, and how even when we think about symbols are basically, they tell the story of our experience to what that thing represents, and language sort of serves that same purpose. Do you want to talk a bit about the distinction between the sort of the wall that is the data sheet, I guess, or like the data, and that contrasted with the narrative, because it's I think we hear it in the video at the beginning about how, you know, 30 seconds doesn't feel like a long time, but when you're in it, it feels like forever. Like that contrast is so fascinating.
Yeah, that wall, you know, it's just like about providing context to the whole thing. And like I guess the context has, like I just mentioned, it has become like this really like grounding element for me in terms of like being able to work from. It's literally become the root of things, you know, for me to work from. And it's so funny that I would have never expected to find comfort in that, you know, like it feels kind of funny, but it has provided a lot of comfort. So I wanted to include some of that. And I mean, initially when Zach and I discussed putting this together, like we always talked about his role as being this sort of impartial, like person that, you know, was not involved and could provide these statistics that I didn't have to write into the narrative. So it was just like a bit of an extension on that, to just like not have to write into my narrative of like, on this day, so, you know, this happened, kind of like explain it too much. But I mean, in a way too, like it could exist without it. I mean, so much of like my so many of my favorite things to do include like doing handwritten things. So it was just like, you know, it felt like a nice extension of that as well, to play around with, you know, the statistics and facts of the day.
Well, and it's interesting thinking about the New York Times cover. One of the things I was interested in after you sort of told me the story was because I was alive then. But I mean, not that I was reading the paper, but it was like, what would I have known at that time from here, you know? And it's like, and really, I think it would have just been statistics. Like one of the amazing things about that cover is there wasn't even a photograph, right? Like today there would be a photo, but at that time you don't even have an image. And how do we transmit information? And I think especially for journalism at that time, a lot of it is quantitative, right? Yes, quantitative, which I don't know, doesn't convey the experience the way that your work does.
Yeah, and it's so funny because like when I had you and my sister, shout out Astrid, doing this work, it's like they found so many more pictures from the 2000 earthquake. Was it 2000?
Yeah, 2001.
Yeah.
Or no, maybe it was 2000. Yeah.
Yeah, earthquake, right? So it's just like, yeah, things have changed so much in terms of what they can capture. But I can see you like reading the New York Times at 5 years old.
I was like sitting in the dirt playing that. I love the version of that 5-year-old. Just like
but
yeah, and just also how I think there's something about really rooted in time and how long it takes for something disastrous and traumatic to occur through that data, right? It's like 38 seconds, which in the grand scheme of things isn't massive. But it got me really thinking, because the first thing I engaged with coming into Geller was that wall of data.
Okay.
And it got me really thinking about this sort of the sense that sometimes these sort of small, quick moments that don't take a lot of time are the ones that actually last the longest in terms of thinking through trauma and experience. And that also got me thinking with, I think it's the video with your sister when she mentions the sound and like that being tied to memory and how different senses sort of are the ones that are able to sort of allow us to experience these crises over time.
Yeah, I got a lot from those interviews, actually, just stuff that I didn't. And there's still 2 more to come. They just take a really long time. But, and they were, they just fill in so many gaps because I have experienced earthquakes, but like, yeah, nothing as big. But even just thinking about the war again and wanting to speak about like, I guess catastrophe or these things that we're all undergoing at the same time, like I feel like it even reflects what we're going through right now with the pandemic, where it's just happening. It's just continuous, right? And I feel like this war was just continuous, right? So like all these things happen at the same time, but it was just kind of, you just like learn to live with, these things. And I think in North America, we've been super lucky, to not have had to endure something that takes over like many years of your life. I don't know how I got there. Sorry.
No, it's actually great. Sorry, Christina, you go.
No, just I think the work evokes thinking like that, right? Like it is also impossible to not think about the moment we're all living through right now, within it. But that complexity really comes through of all of these, like it got me really thinking about what is the thing, what's the crisis that ultimately shifts things, right? Like even in a personal experience, because at least what I know from your story, your family emigrated to Canada soon after the earthquake. And it's sort of like this buildup of crises after crises after crises, and which is the one that finally is the thing that just causes some sort of shift or break in that repetition. And then like in this, I don't know, hopeful is such a like loaded word, but or concept right now, but like just got me thinking about, okay, what's that shift now? Like what's the thing that gets us out of this? Is it another massive crisis somehow, or
Well, and the contrast between like I air quotes natural disaster and then sort of social or political conflicts, especially when they're happening simultaneously. Like what are those two things? How do they interact with each other? And like which Christina, is one of the reasons I was really excited to kind of have you come talk as well. As I think that the possibilities that come out of disaster and the ways that people do come together, which I think is reflected in the we of the project as well, are I think often misunderstood, right? Like I think that we don't always assume that that's human nature to become unified through some forms of tragedy or conflict, but then at the same time, there's political conflict that is literally, a civil, like two forces that are in opposition. Like, how do those things relate to each other? And yeah, I don't know if I have a question, which is kind of useless, but even I guess I'll just add that it's interesting how, and I guess we talked about this, but the geographical conditions that kind of created that earthquake, literally one plate oppressing another one, caused this uprising, and then you have almost the same thing on a social and political level. It's fascinating, the parallels, but the ways that we behave differently to them.
Maybe to jump in related to this, because the fragment of text in the work that I see as really speaking to this is the bit about living in a culture of matriarchs and how that sort of collective caring in time of crisis was like natural. And so it seemed to me like a really deliberate, somewhat political statement to include that in the work as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, it's hard because like so many countries, we can't just say like Latin America, but they're very violent. It's a very violent culture towards women, so, but yeah, that's really who took care of everything, and most of the time, like in that particular neighborhood that I grew up in, culturally at the time too, so many of the women stayed home, and as being like not in the school age, or our school days are also like much shorter there. That's who was around, and like who made sure we were all okay. And I mean, it's really shaped my sense of community too, in terms of expectations, because like I feel like even culturally, even in like art scenes and things, like we think of community as just like people who you have things in common with, or like, but the way I saw community is just really this random group of people that just happen to live alongside one another. And I was thinking, maybe it's like socioeconomic, but like my sister mentions in her video, there's like mud huts, just like behind our house, and there's like 10 people to like a 2-bedroom house, right? So like it's such a disparate amount of, or disparate kinds of people in this space, but like through these tragedies, like the women were always there, and like always kind of like running things and making sure everyone was okay. And it was just like, it can be, I don't know, it's just so incorporated into the culture in a way that, I don't see here, and I've never seen here, even with, your neighbors. There's a certain amount of like distrust in the way cultures are organized here. And I don't have like the answers for why that is necessarily, right? But like, yeah, culturally it's very specific. And I think it does mimic a lot of cultures outside of North America, but that are like, not considered white. Like, I feel like, my indigenous friends and coworkers were very much struck by that line too, because they can relate to that in their cultures as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for our current moment, it seems like a really helpful reminder as well to point toward, because we're sort of living in this time, and not just even centered around the summer or even 2020, but for a while, where we're constantly like the never-ending crises, even socially and politically. So it's like you're offering solutions sort of in this really generous but minimal way, right? Like a little bit of a prod and a little bit of a suggestion, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize that role of women for sure.
And especially in times of, I mean, as you said, like in the present moment, in times of crisis or necessity, the people that step up to do what becomes deemed essential or whatever, but is the stuff that keeps both communities together and keeps people alive, and how overlooked that is, unless it's like immediately becomes sort of drawn to the surface through crisis. I feel like it's an important idea to keep coming back to, hopefully not through the existence of crisis, but sort of to keep reminding ourselves of.
Yeah, and that really is how it happens, right? Like, I think we've sort of been brainwashed through propaganda of like Hollywood in a lot of ways, but the way that people do respond to crisis is to work together and to collaborate, to take care of one another. It just really is. And, of course that can be sort of offset by politicians, people in charge, those that want to sort of profit off of disaster. But ultimately, the experience that you experienced is a common one, where people do come together to help make one another feel safe. But I think we really need like a lot of reminders about that. And it's hard to know when you're in the thick of it, like how do you make use of those reminders, or what's the best way to remind people like, okay, we can work together, we can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I really appreciated about this exhibition, with all of the bits and pieces, like even this conversation and the elements online of sort of like, they are all these different entry points that I think a number of different people can sort of hold on to and maybe walk away, maybe coming up with ideas of how to work together when that crisis hits in their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's a very generous take.
Yeah, it's important.
I was really interested in this idea of, I guess we talked about it a little bit, fiction versus nonfiction. This is a bit of a deviation from what we're talking about, but I'm interested in I was thinking this morning that the opposite of fiction would arguably be fact, right? And then we don't use that sort of categorization, and nonfiction is such an incredibly broad. It's all it is not fiction, right? But I mean, in a way, it makes space for this sort of interweaving of narrative and memory, and it made me think about. I wonder how you approach material in terms of thinking about how you represent actual events, and also as like a sub question, do you think about creating work that's rooted more exclusively in that sort of traditional category as fiction through a similar sort of form?
I mean, I admire people that write fiction so much. I'm just like, how? I mean, I think there's probably like always a sense of like drawing from your life, but I think it is. I've been thinking about it, and it's particularly true with comics because it's such a like huge genre that's not really a genre, and I think it really does fit into just like fiction and nonfiction, as opposed to having all these like subgenres as like mystery and like, romance and stuff like that. Because I mean, it's not a new format, but it's one that's gaining popularity, right? But it really is one where it's just like, there's memoirs and then there's like other funny things, that are like either comic books or just like, I don't know, people write about all sorts of stuff in comics and draw a lot of stuff in comics. So yeah, it's tough. Like I'm still like trying to answer those questions myself. Like, I mean, I have friends who are writers, and I'm just like, how does your mom deal with this? And even this, like, I will say that, like, just even I felt a little tentative about even like that matriarch line, because I feel like it does imply for me personally that my mom wasn't around and she wasn't very present, so it's just like, it's hard to go there. It's hard to like dig into these things that could possibly, hurt other people. So I'm honestly still trying to like negotiate around that. But I feel like even with like memoirs or things that are, are nonfiction, like there has to be like room for all sorts of, poetry and like embellishments in a way, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
Oh, it's Adam. He
Yeah.
says our time is up.
Oh, your time's not up. I just wanted to jump in and say that I know we've got a few loyal folks who've been with us this whole time. If you would like to ask some questions for our guests today, I would love to pass them on to answer them. But don't let me stop the rolling train here. I'm greatly enjoying this conversation. So.
But yeah,
I was going to say in relation to what you said about comic books, I always felt like comics had this, especially before they really hit the mainstream the way that they seem to in the past decade or so. It felt like there was such space to experiment in a way that you don't always have with other sort of commercial I say mainstream, even though it's something that you could buy at a corner store. They didn't feel as restricted, and it's maybe exciting to think about that transfer, like following the medium as it maybe moves into other spaces, like moving into a gallery space and allowing that sort of, not that a gallery is a traditional space, but the idea of getting to sort of break some of those molds or those expectations of the ways things are done.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know if you know Michael DeForge, but his comics are kind of like that for me, where like, his characters just kind of look like blobs sometimes. Like he's just really, this sounds like insulting, but it's not. He's really amazing. But he's just taken the idea of like, what a comic should look like with, specific characters that like, look like people or even that, and just really taken off with that and created whole worlds. And I think that's that's really appealing about that. But it I'm finding that there's a lot of memoirs within comics, so I think it seems to fit what people are trying to express in a way that like maybe longer, or just writing a memoir on its own. Although people are still, I don't know, I guess people love writing memoirs.
But that's interesting. I wonder if there's like, you maybe think like, oh, there's an element of like controlling of one's image embedded in getting to like create something in that form, right? Even through illustration. Like, does that, I guess I have two questions. Like, do you find that there was something nice about getting to sort of illustrate that story in your own way and sort of transfer maybe what those memories look like into something other people could perceive? I'll end there.
And there was like, did I enjoy it? What is that kind of what you're saying? Or
yeah, like did you find it like helpful to be able to control
okay,
the sort of visual version of that story, right? Like,
yeah, and maybe it is control, but for me it's just like it feels like the only way I could tell it. Like it's just a format that really makes sense to the way maybe my brain works, and totally. Like I feel like I was saying before, I feel like I've lived with these images for so long, and to get them out in whatever way I can has definitely felt like a relief. I definitely cried a couple times, but
yeah, wow.
yeah.
I wonder too if it's, you know, like every form comes with its restrictions and sort of expectations. Like, had this been a documentary, it would sort of read maybe more toward the sort of factual and just laying out the facts. And so I wonder if that blurriness between fact and fiction is sort of more comfortable within graphic novels, especially because so much of the work you speak about, like, not quite sure if you're remembering it right. So that even within yourself, there's this sort of blurriness between fact and fiction.
Yeah, there really is. Because like I was pretty young when all these things happened. Like the earthquake specifically, I was 3 years old, and so then, you know, and by the time we moved, I was 8 years old. So it was a long time ago. So again, that's so much I'm dealing with, like this romanticized version of things too, right? So yeah, it makes and childlike imagination of things. So it makes sense to do it in this format where I can just like really play with the format and the page, you know, in a way that I couldn't be able to describe otherwise.
And it's interesting the way, like, I was thinking that in some ways, even if memory doesn't factually sort of record events, perhaps it factually records the way we felt, or you know, and conveys them maybe through images that we that make sense to us or whatever, right?
And I operate so much on feelings. Very feelings-based person, Pisces. But
oh right, I forgot you're a Pisces.
Oh, you're a Pisces too, Christina. Yeah,
Perfect sense.
Yeah, for sure. But you know, the things that's also relevant here is that, and talking about feelings of this time and space, is that this night that I'm describing too could have been any number of different nights, because a lot of stuff happened and a lot of the same people and care was involved, right? So there was always gathering, there was always, you know, a collective mourning at times, you know, so it could have been one of many nights, you know, where like we were in hammocks, you know, someone was giving me something to eat and making sure I was okay, you know? So it's
And it's funny because it's never something I thought about going through it. I was never like, I don't know if this is true. You know what I mean?
She lied.
This like never crossed my mind.
We do have one comment or question, I should say. Well, there's one comment and one question, but Vivek wants to know, when is your comic book coming out? Because the fans want to know. And I have a question that's related to this as well. I might say it's been really awesome. One of the things right now is that, you know, when we were first putting this show up, we weren't sure how people would get to experience it because we didn't know to what degree we'd be able to open the gallery. And we have a couple of Saturdays we've opened the patio, and especially at the beginning of the show, a lot of your family came out and really animated the show with their own relationships to it. And I'm really curious about how you're thinking about this project is changing from the way that it's being received, and how your family and your friends looking at this work is changing the way you think about it. And yeah, when is your book coming out?
When is my book coming out? Vivek Shraya is my editor of everything, first of all. No, she's super encouraging, and it's just been something that's been in the works for such a long time. So it's finally happening. I have some government grants to be writing this year, and it hasn't happened as smoothly as, you know, we would have liked for many reasons. But yeah, like I remember Michelle at the beginning of this whole thing, she was like, do you still want to do this? Because we didn't know if anybody would come to the space. So I think it was helpful because it made us think of all these other elements that we could incorporate with it, like the interviews and the videos and everything. Yeah, I definitely have thought about like what it would mean to do something like this again. And I think I definitely want to push myself to think bigger and like incorporate more like objects and have things be a bit more interactive in that way too. I've also been thinking too about like taking stories outside of the gallery space. Like I've done some murals in the city, and I'm like, it'd be cool to do like stories, you know, the way we do like street art, you know? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just thinking about, no, my family loved it. And like they have a really fun time seeing these things and taking over spaces. Like, honestly, if we weren't under COVID restrictions, there would have been a full like Salvadorian party at that gallery. Like, for sure. Bring out the pupusas. Like, absolutely. They felt very like limited with what they could do at the moment, but you know, keep everyone safe. But no, I really appreciate it too. Like, you know, anything. And then I think culturally, I was just speaking about this with Michelle, where it's just like when you have like diverse voices in spaces, like they tend to come with a whole community behind them, you know, of people who wouldn't necessarily come into the space. And yeah, and it's just like, it's good to have a space where like kids can run around and again, like, you know, and just like hang out and partake in whatever way. So no, it's been really great. And I'm so thankful to Latitude for putting up with it again, because there's a lot of them.
It was fun.
Can I ask you, you got me thinking about the way you talked about representing your family's story and about approaching it with each of them. And I have this theory that maintenance, care, and attention are three sort of versions of the same thing. And I was wondering, I don't want to like, I wonder how you feel about sort of being the storyteller for your family now, if you think of this as like an act of care. I mean, both of sort of thinking about all of their feelings and their input, and in a way, an act of sort of maintaining these collective memories. And I guess if you want to talk about that, if that resonates at all.
Yeah, it's tough. Like, I really resent responsibility. So part of me is like, oh. But yeah, you know, I feel really lucky that there's, you know, we're all still around and we're all able to fill in the gaps, especially for me, because I was such a kid. And again, I mentioned that I'm really comforted by like the facts. But no, I think it's an incredible privilege that they want me to say these things. It is a little nerve-wracking, you know, because like I used to keep my family really separate from my art at one point, you know, so it's having them in these spaces is like a new experience, you know, and showing this really different side of myself to them. So there's that anxiety a little bit of that are, you know, my story is not just necessarily mine, but you know, like I would never want to tell like my sister's side of things. It's always going to be me, but like they're always going to be present and no matter what I do. So but you know, as displaced people, it just feels really important to document these things, you know, like we don't have like the records that people do it, and we basically I feel really lucky that like my dad was a like really avid photographer, and there's a ton of pictures of us, you know, that we can work from, and he's still around and he's still a huge resource for all this stuff that happened. Like he'll probably be the last interview I post, but he just like remembers everything. Like he's very, very sharp in what remembering everything that went on. So he talked a lot, so his will take a lot of time to edit. but no, I feel really lucky, and I think it's important because we don't get to have the records that other people have, you know, of our lives, and like so it just feels important to do that work, and I've been enjoying it for sure.
I would love to echo the other comment that's been left from Tiffany on the stream here, that I also have really enjoyed this conversation. Tiffany describes it as beautiful, and takes a moment to talk about the silence and the gravity of some of the topics about moments of crisis and about these matriarchal and familial relationships. And it's really a pleasure having the three of you on here to talk about all this.
Can I ask one last quick question?
Oh yeah. Don't stop.
I was thinking about how you. I guess I don't know what's going to happen with it, but I'm assuming once it's over, it'll be painted over. It'll be documented and then painted over. Is that accurate? So I was curious how you feel about that, like about the relation to something being sort of temporal.
Well, you know, I think it's great that Tiffany left a comment, because I admire Tiffany a lot, and she's an architect, and she recently made a comment that's really stuck with me, and I feel like it echoes just what I feel in general, where she's, as an architect, she mentioned that she doesn't believe like buildings are meant to last forever, you know, and I really thought about that, because we, you know, especially in Edmonton, where a lot of our historic buildings get torn down or whatever, and people really seem to mourn that. But, you know, for me, it's always been like these, you know, our colonial buildings, and I'm sure like perpetuated a lot of violence on like stolen land kind of thing. So like, should they be up, you know? And I think just in general, like, I think maybe our culture up here in North America has a sense that, you know, certain comforts, and this pandemic is a perfect example of that, certain comforts and certain ways of life are going to be forever, right? And, you know, and there is this impermanence that we all live with and we try to ignore. So like, I think, you know, and it's something that I love about street art too, is just like, there's this, you know, impermanence to it, right? So, yeah, I'm fine for the, you know, the artwork to have served its purpose for this time, and, you know, it'll make room for something else, for something great. And I think like, yeah, that same thing can be said about like, you know, buildings, like Tiffany said, you know, they will serve someone else in a better way.
And it echoes what's in the show, like in the sense that everybody went and slept outside. And it like, it's fascinating how these things that we put a lot of trust in at this moment of disaster become totally untrustworthy. And I mean, even there were some other articles I was reading too, where people that were at a hotel ended up sleeping in the garden at the hotel. Unrelated to that, I was wondering, hearing you talk about storytelling and related to this idea of sort of physical object versus, I guess, oral storytelling, or just sort of keeping your memories through conversation. Like, do you think about memory as something organic, as something that in some ways is meant to change and evolve and to move with time? End of question.
I mean, you know, I think it's just, yeah, I think that naturally it just evolves and changes. I mean, even like our perception of like how we're viewing this pandemic and what we thought at the beginning of it, or how we remember it now, is like very different, you know, from what we're experiencing now. So I do think it does change and evolve whether we want it or not, you know?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I really love that, and especially situated around this conversation of permanence or impermanence. And it makes me really want to see this work like installed again in the future, and just to see how it shifts, or, you know, even how your experience of the memory shifts between now and then as well. I love the idea of thinking that it's just constantly a work that changes over time.
Yeah. Especially in contrast with like, I mean, this is unrelated, but I keep thinking about the way that when we talk about sort of, in the States, they talk about the Constitution sometimes as like a living document. And it's like, it feels so inanimate in so many ways, you know, and it's like, well, it's probably like people probably don't go back and question it anywhere near as often as they would if it was something spoken that we passed on orally, the way that memory moves, often sort of between families and just through conversation, which does feel living, right? You know, and I think the idea of it being installed again, as you said, and being different is so exciting. Like I totally echo what you think. That would be incredible.
Yeah, I definitely have thought about if I would install again and what that would look like, and it does look different for sure.
That's great.
If people want to see this version before it does get painted,
Adam's gonna paint it over.
I am eventually gonna paint it over. We are open by appointment Wednesday through Friday, so you can book an appointment on our website, where you can also watch the video interviews that will continue to be posted there. The show is open until September 12th, and on Saturdays, weather permitting, we have been opening the garage door, and you're welcome to just come by on a drop-in basis and sit on the patio or explore the exhibitions. I also wanted to say that we are installing another show in our larger gallery spaces. So there's a bit of overlap. If you wanted to come by next weekend, there will be work by Elise Rasmussen in the main galleries. And I would encourage you to come and see both shows. And following the end of Michelle's show on September 12th, after I paint it over, we are pretty excited to have Mitchell Chalafu in the garage later in the fall. So stay tuned to find out a little bit more about what that's going to look like. Thank you so much to the three of you again.
Thank you.
I'm so glad we were able to do this.
Yes.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in and joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really great.
Yeah, thank you.
I love thinking about so many things.
I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours.
I have no doubt that you could. So.
We're forgetting that other people are watching, and maybe.
Yeah, that's good. It's good. Yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah, you as well.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks, Michelle, for your work.
Thank you
Yeah, thank
so
you.
much. You two are a dream. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Ya está temblando. Se dice nomás, está temblando, vámonos para afuera. Me fui para la casa y fui a la parada de buses a esperar a mis hijas. Estudiaban lejos, se habían tenido que venir caminando. Pasa varios días uno durmiendo afuera de la casa porque da miedo. Entonces da miedo que vuelva a haber otro terremoto y se le caiga la casa encima, porque a varias gente les cayó.